So welcome everyone. On behalf of the Royal Society of Canada, it is really my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar of the Royal Society College entitled From the Carbon Cycle to the Carbon Tax. We're really excited to have you today for this event. Just a little note about the Royal Society of Canada. La Société royale du Canada et l'Académie nationale du Canada, elle reconnaît les principaux intellectuels, universitaires, chercheurs et artistes du Canada et les mobilise dans des discussions et des débats ouverts pour faire progresser les connaissances, encourager une compréhension interdisciplinaire intégrée et aborder des questions essentielles pour le Canada et les Canadiens. This particular webinar is organized by the College of the Royal Society, which is the Young Academy of Canada. I would like, before I start as well, to do a land acknowledgement. The RSC is hosting this event and their offices are located on the traditional and ceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. From coast to coast to coast, we are grateful to acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, First Nations, and Métis people and recognize the dozens of languages and cultures Indigenous people have brought that enrich what many call the Turtle Island. So it is really my great pleasure today to host this webinar that is going to host a conversation between two prominent scholars of the College of Royal Society, Peter Deitch and Deborah Wunsch. Peter Deitch est une autorité mondiale dans le secteur de l'éthique économique. Ses travaux portent sur des questions de justice en distribution du revenu, ainsi que sur l'évaluation des politiques économiques. Deitch is the author of Catching Capital, The Ethics of Tax Competition, as well as the co-author of Do Central Banks Serve the People? His expertise is regularly solicited in the media. Nous avons également avec nous Deborah Wunsch, qui est physicienne de l'atmosphère et joue un rôle de premier plan dans le développement et l'utilisation des mesures des gaz à effet de serre par télédétection. She has fostered the development of a global network of instruments that occupies a critical niche between in situ and space-based measurements of carbon dioxide and methane. Her research on greenhouse gases emission sources and natural sinks provides new insights into the global carbon cycle. So today, as I mentioned earlier, the discussion is going to be about the carbon cycle as well as the carbon tax. And this is really a very special moment right now because as carbon tax is being hotly debated in the public sphere, we really thought that it would be interesting to bring to you a physicist and a philosopher to discuss these ideas. And as such, we're really excited to have our first presentation by Deborah, who is doing work on measuring more precisely carbon in the atmosphere. So Deborah, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very honored to be here, and I'm excited to tell you a little bit about what's going on in my world of measuring atmospheric greenhouse gases. I wanted to start by making sure we're all on the same page when it comes to what we mean by the global carbon budget and the carbon cycle. So every couple of years, scientists put together a global budget of carbon dioxide emissions. And this figure that you're looking at here from the Global Carbon Project shows where the emissions are coming from. And they come from human-made emissions from burning fossil fuels and land use change and so on, and where those emissions end up. The main sinks of carbon dioxide are our vegetation and our oceans, and what's not absorbed by them remains in the atmosphere, making the atmosphere kind of a dumping ground, a sort of global garbage can. Carbon dioxide is a very long-lived gas and will remain in the atmosphere longer than our lifetimes, which means that emissions of carbon dioxide can accumulate in the atmosphere. So a similar approach is taken for the global methane budget, which is what you're seeing here. Methane is another greenhouse gas that's primarily emitted from fossil fuel production and use, and methane is the main component of natural gas from the agriculture and waste sector and from wetlands. It's a shorter-lived greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, and it has an atmospheric lifetime on the order of about a decade. And this is because it can react with some chemicals in the atmosphere that break it down. So in this graphic, hopefully you'll be able to see that there are sort of two sets of numbers, one that's labeled bottom-up view and one that's labeled a top-down view. And those refer to the methods by which these budgets are put together and calculated. Bottom-up refers to inventories, which sum up all the emissions that we know about. For example, if you were a farmer and ran a farm with 100 dairy cows that are fed grass, for example, you can find what's called an emission factor for each cow, and then you'd multiply that number by 100 to get your total emissions for your farm. Top down, on the other hand, refers to methods that rely on atmospheric measurements to calculate these emissions. And these two methods might not agree, but fundamentally, global surface temperature, which is really what we're most interested in when we talk about climate change, is directly related to the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and therefore constraining emissions with atmospheric measurements is really important. Great. So how do we know that emissions are rising? Well, our atmospheric measurements have shown us this. On the left is the record of atmospheric carbon dioxide from Mauna Loa, Hawaii, that began in the late 1950s by Charles David Keeling. The record shows clearly a year-over-year increase over time. So the x-axis is time, starting in 1958, coming up to the present, and the y-axis is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The global averaged atmospheric methane concentrations are shown on the right, beginning in the mid-1980s, and they show a much more complicated picture of methane growth, but nevertheless, both of these figures show an increase in greenhouse gases over time, showing that the emissions have increased. So these records are collected using instruments that are located on the ground and that take samples of the atmosphere, and those samples are then analyzed in the lab or on site to determine the concentrations themselves. So while we have long records of the atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations from individual locations worldwide, there are only about 100 or so of those stations that are collecting measurements. So to fill in these gaps, we've started launching satellites to space. And the satellite that I'm showing you on this slide is from the Orbiting Carbon Observatory 2, which was launched in 2014. And it can collect measurements within a 2-week period from what you can see in that top right figure there. So millions of measurements collected over the globe over a couple of weeks. And the video on the bottom that just played for you shows the measurements as a function of time going from left to right again. And the South Pole is sort of close to us. The North Pole is far away from us. And you can see the seasonal cycle and the increase in the colors over time. So from these measurements, researchers at the Jet Propulsion Lab and elsewhere are able to infer sort of more country scale net emissions from the measurements of CO2 that we have. So if we want to get down to smaller emission sources like cities, and I would argue that cities play an important role, we need to do something more. So urban areas are a very important source of carbon emissions to the atmosphere. In North America, urban activities produce up to 80% of the carbon dioxide emissions to the atmosphere, and it's about 70% for cities worldwide. So reducing greenhouse gas emissions within cities is not only important for our climate, but it's also important for air quality and our health, since many of the activities that produce greenhouse gases also produce pollutants like carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, and particulate matter. There are also many municipal level climate organizations in place around the world fighting to reduce emissions, and one in particular is the C40 Cities Network, which is a global network of mayors trying to reduce emissions in their cities. And Toronto has been a member of the C40 since around 2005. Thanks. So to support the efforts of municipal governments, we need to provide them with measurements. Their inventories of greenhouse gases are based on the reports from the industry and reports from the gas company and so on. And to ensure that emission reduction efforts result in actual atmospheric emissions reductions, we need to measure. So we have a pilot project in Toronto that we are trying to do just this, which we call TAME, which stands for Toronto Atmospheric Monitoring of Emissions. And the idea is that we'll set up several locations around the city with instruments designed to measure both greenhouse gases and air quality gases as well. And this is intended to be a long-term network so that we can monitor the atmosphere over many years, hopefully watching as these gas concentrations reduce over time. And finally, as part of this as well, we need to know how much carbon dioxide Toronto's trees will absorb so that we can accurately assess the human-caused part of the picture. And this is important, particularly in Toronto, because the city has plans to increase its tree cover from about 30 to 40% by 2050. So having a way to measure the carbon uptake from the vegetation will be very helpful. So just to summarize, we have a reasonable handle on global and country scale greenhouse gas emissions given the observing networks that are currently in place. But smaller scales are difficult, and cities pose particular challenges, but also offer many benefits to human health and quality of life. And I would argue that we really need to verify our emissions policies using atmospheric measurements wherever possible. And I think that is all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for your presentation. And again, if you have some questions for Deborah, please use the Q&A button that you have at the bottom of your screen so that you could write questions, and we will ask them to Deborah at the end of the talk of Peter. So Peter, on his side, has been working on the notion of a fairer and more effective carbon tax. So he has some slides to show us about that. So Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Audrey, for the introduction, et merci à la Société Royale du Canada pour l'invitation à cet événement. Thank you also, Deborah, for your great insights into emission measurement. So the goal of my presentation is to comment on one of the main policy tools to mitigate climate change, the much discussed, especially in Canada right now in the election cycle, the much discussed carbon tax. And I want to show three things. So first, that the version of the carbon tax that we have at the moment in Canada is largely ineffective. Second, to make it more effective, we would need what is called a progressive carbon tax. So the idea here is that the more you emit, the higher the tax rate that you need to pay. And third, I want to convince you that such a progressive carbon tax would not only be more effective, but it would also be fairer. Let me start by just making a few remarks about the precise nature of the challenge that we're facing, as well as the focus of my presentation. So the first thing to say here is that Canada actually has two kinds of carbon pricing, one for individual consumers and one for industrial emitters. And I'm only going to be talking about the carbon tax on individual consumers. If you want in the Q&A, I could tell you why I think that exclusively focusing on the other one, namely industrial emitters, as some people propose, is actually a bad idea. The second thing is that it's worth reminding ourselves that the explicit goal of the carbon tax is to reduce emissions. So if it generates revenues for the government, that's a nice side effect, but it's not the purpose of the tax. The purpose of the tax is to bring emissions down. And in that context, in 2015, under the Paris Agreement, states have agreed to so-called nationally determined contributions to reduce their emissions. So Canada, for instance, committed to a 40% reduction from 2005 emission levels by the year 2030. Now, the fact that we think about emissions at a national level, at a level of states, I would argue is part of the problem. And I'm not the first by any means to argue that. Why is that a problem? Because it obscures the fact that within states, there are huge differences when it comes to individual emissions. So studies show that the 10% highest individual emitters in any country are roughly responsible for about 50% of the emissions. And unsurprisingly, there's a very high correlation between disposable income and emissions. And that'll become important in a moment. Final point here to set things up is to note that low-income individuals both emit less and are more vulnerable to some of the risks of climate change, including worse health outcomes, natural disasters, and so on. You might already see why the carbon tax that we have at the moment is not particularly effective. If you look at the emissions of the wealthy, because of their sheer size, they represent, if you like, the low-hanging fruit of emission reduction. However, it's precisely that low-hanging fruit that is very unlikely to be affected by the carbon tax that we have at the moment. Why is that? Because, as an economist would put it, the demand of wealthy people for carbon-intensive goods is fairly inelastic. They can just afford to pay the tax, but consume and emit just as much as they did before. They're not changing their behavior. But remember, the goal of the tax is to change behavior. So that's why it's ineffective. And we can see this in Canada's emission statistics, right? We're only about 1/12 of the way to that 40% reduction that we've committed to by the year 2030. So what needs to change? Consider the following analogy. In some countries, Finland and Switzerland are prominent examples here. Authorities at some point got frustrated with the fact that traffic fines were not a very effective deterrent for people to slow down on the roads. So they changed them to become income dependent. And as a result, at least in one case in Switzerland, someone had to pay a traffic fine for speeding that was in the 7 figures, so more than $1 million Swiss francs, which is considerably more than $1 million. Now, the idea of a progressive carbon tax is the same. For the first 1.5 tons of CO2 equivalent, say, which is the amount that is compatible with the global carbon budget, if everyone emitted that, you might not have to pay any carbon tax at all. But beyond that threshold, your tax rate would go up more than proportionately with your emissions. So if you look at the right-hand side of your screen here, if someone owns and operates a private jet, for instance, and has annual emissions in excess of 50 tons of CO2 equivalent, they would have to pay something like $1 million for every additional ton of emissions. Right? So the precise numbers are not important here, but the idea is that the tax rate goes up proportionately, more than proportionately with the emissions. Now, of course, that raises an important question of implementation, right? Can we actually measure individual emissions? And I think this is where there's an interesting link with Deborah's work on emission measurement. So in a way, this proposal that I'm discussing here goes even more fine-grained than cities. It looks at individuals. Right? So can we do it? And I think the answer is we can't do it perfectly, but we have good enough proxies that are already available. So if you look at the left-hand side of your screen, for any of us, the main categories of our emissions are housing and transport. Right? And for those, we already have data readily available. We know how much people fly, we know what car they drive, we know what heating they use for their home, etc. So it could be done. For the final step in my argument, one of the reasons why the carbon tax has become so controversial here in Canada and also elsewhere is that it's the idea or the suggestion that it's hard on average Canadians, on average people in society. Now, two things need to be said here. One, in one sense, that's simply false because we've combined the carbon tax with a generous rebate system that sends some of the revenue from the tax straight back to low-income Canadians. So in the large majority of cases, people actually come out ahead financially. Right? However, in another sense, the arguments that we've just gone through show that there is something to the complaint that the current carbon tax is hard on average Canadians. After all, even if they get the rebate, they do have to change their behavior. They feel the pinch of reducing carbon-intensive activities, whereas the wealthy or those with high disposable income, as we've seen, they don't feel that pinch. So that's where there is an imbalance and an unfairness. Now, by contrast, you can see that a carbon tax would be just from that perspective. And it would be just for 3 reasons. The first 2 are relatively obvious. As we've seen, the wealthy bear more responsibility for climate change because they emit more. They also are the ones who have the financial means to actually do something about it. Right? Now, and I want to point out a third reason here that is perhaps a little more interesting. Imagine a wealthy person who complains that the carbon tax, the progressive carbon tax that I've defended here, puts too much of a burden on them. So here's a reason to think that it would not be a legitimate complaint. Virtually all theories of economic justice today agree that the current income and wealth inequalities that we observe today are unjustly high. And from that perspective, wealthy individuals cannot legitimately complain that a progressive carbon tax would be unjust or unfair towards them, because at least from a moral perspective, they don't have a right to that income that we would be taxing to begin with. So in sum, I hope to have convinced you that the current carbon tax that we have is both ineffective and unfair in an important sense, which explains a lot of the political debate, and that we would need a progressive carbon tax to make the system better. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Peter, for your presentation. So now I'm going to turn the floor to the audience here and ask if you guys have questions that you want to ask, and we're going to take them from the Q&A, so definitely type your questions in the Q&A. So we have a first question from Nemi Bantia. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. And it's a question, and I think it can apply to both of you. And I think, Peter, you sort of alluded to it in your presentation. How do your GHG measurements compare to the IPCC prediction and scenario, which I think is more a question for you, Deborah. But I guess it also calls for how much progress we have in our goals. And I think you mentioned, Peter, that we are at about a 12% on our way to achieving the goal for 2030, for the year 2030. So Deborah, do you want to answer the question of Nemi?
Sure. It's a great question and kind of an interesting, well, the way I'm going to answer it is like this. The IPCC basically puts out national emissions that are aggregated from us. So we give them the numbers, or to the UNFCCC, we give them those numbers, and that gets it folded into the IPCC. But sorry, I'm distracted by some offensive stuff in the Q&A. I'm going to close it. But the answer to your question is, when we're looking at scales that are smaller than countries, like on the scale of cities, what happens is you take these national levels and you have to disaggregate them or split them up into smaller scales like cities. And that's really difficult to do. And what we've found in the past is quite interesting discrepancies between what the measurements are telling us and what the actual inventories would tell us for, say, in the city. For example, there is the Keel Valley landfill, which is thought to be the single largest methane emission landfill, I think, in the country, which is just north of the city of Toronto. It's meant to be a huge emitter of methane, and we do not see that in our atmospheric measurements. It's substantially a smaller emission source than would be predicted in the inventories. But there are sources of emissions in Toronto that are not at all cataloged in these emissions inventories. So it's quite an interesting story when you start really breaking it down. It turns out that we have these things called combined sewage overflow systems, where you have sewage and water, and it's an anoxic environment, and whenever you have a lack of oxygen, you produce methane. Those aren't in the inventories at all, and yet we see emissions coming from them every time we pass by. And then the big emitters like this landfill are substantially smaller emission sources than we thought. So it's a mixed bag. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Deborah, for your answer. Do you want to add anything, Peter, or?
No, I have a little question for Deborah as well, but we'll wait until we've run out of questions in the chat. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Peter. Alors, we have a question in French. Can I read it in French, Deborah? Will you be able to see the wordly translation, or? I can try to live translate as well. I'll read it in French and I'll try to live translate it. So, okay. Pourquoi une taxe carbone dirigée seulement vers les entreprises et industries serait inefficace? On ne peut pas anticiper. Oh, the question is for Peter anyway, I think. So, pourquoi une carbone taxe dirigée seulement vers les entreprises et industries serait inefficace? On ne peut pas anticiper que les industries refileront probablement cette taxe à leurs clients, donc à une population générale, ce qui devrait avoir une incidence sur leur comportement ultimement.
Oui, c'est une très bonne question. Alors, penser à l'incidence de la taxe carbone est exactement la bonne intuition, mais pour les mêmes raisons qu'on a vues dans ma présentation, une taxe uniquement sur les industries serait inefficace. Pourquoi? Alors, comme vous l'observez parfaitement bien, s'il y a une taxe carbone sur l'industrie refilera le coût aux consommateurs. Mais parmi les consommateurs, comme on a vu, on a, pour simplifier, deux catégories, les riches et les pauvres. Alors, les riches émettent le plus, mais si le prix est refilé aux riches, ils s'en foutent parce qu'ils ont le budget pour continuer à consommer comme ils veulent. Les autres, par exemple, changeront leur comportement, mais les autres n'émettent pas beaucoup. Donc, pour les mêmes raisons que j'ai expliquées dans la présentation, une taxe exclusivement mise sur les pollueurs industriels sera inefficace. Alors, en bout de ligne, je pense qu'il faut, comme on l'a maintenant, il faut les deux. Il faut travailler à la fois sur le côté de la demande et sur le côté de l'offre. Mais c'est en partie un problème avec les modèles économiques qu'on a. Les modèles économiques qu'on a présument souvent que les agents économiques qui sont tous les mêmes. Mais comme ce n'est pas le cas, comme les riches émettent plus et répondent moins bien à une taxe carbone, ces mesures seraient inefficaces. J'espère que ça répond à la question, mais c'est exactement la bonne question à poser.
Merci beaucoup, Peter, et merci, Genodra, pour ta question. Gendrona, pardon, pour ta question. Now we have a question again for Peter, I believe, from Creedier. Thank you for your clear and informative perspective on carbon tax. My question relates to carbon benefits, specifically in terms of the natural climate solution and the use of nature to sequester CO2 and methane. How do we incentivize landowners, then lower income local communities and farmers, to participate in climate mitigation by receiving benefits for how they manage lands? Taxes are punitive, but benefits are rewards. It's an excellent question. Thank you. And maybe, Deborah, you'll want to step in as well on that. Peter, go ahead. You could start answering the question.
Okay, I'll go first. So I think there's two aspects here. One is the substantive aspect about setting the right incentives for the right categories of people in the economy. And when it comes to agriculture in particular, I think we do have a balance to strike. Right? Maybe Deborah can speak to the fact, and I think one of your charts showed it, how much emissions come from agriculture. Right? So we have to balance the benefits of agriculture with these emissions. Now, from an economic perspective, what we want to do is we want to internalize the externalities, those emissions, into the pricing of agriculture. Right? Now, if we do that without providing some kind of compensation for agriculture, then that will be very expensive to agriculture. So plausibly, what we need is a kind of system as we have it now for individual consumers, where we have some cost when you emit, but some rebate for those who need a rebate. Right? So that's the substantive issue. It's not a cosmetic issue, but it's a framing issue, is what we call that thing that we use. Right? So unfortunately, taxes have become very unpopular because, as you suggest in your question, they're presented as punitive. I don't think taxes are punitive at all. I love paying my taxes in Canada because I see the benefits that I get for those taxes in terms of healthcare, in terms of education for my kids, in terms of childcare when the kids were little, in terms of infrastructure. So I think taxes are a good thing from a community's perspective. Now the discourse has been captured a little bit by a small government anti-tax rhetoric, but I think that's misleading. Right? But I think that needs to be separated from the carbon tax issue. So take, for instance, the Liberal leadership campaign right now. I think one of the strategies that we see in that forum is people who just want to take off the word carbon tax, call it something else, but probably leave it very close to what we have at the moment.
Maybe I'll use this as a prompt to ask a follow-up question to Deborah on that same topic. So Deborah, you mentioned that you see, for instance, the benefit of having trees for lowering emissions. So can you measure emissions, but also absorption of CO2? And can you speak as well for how you would measure positive initiatives to absorb CO2 or methane?
So yeah, you can measure the absorption of carbon dioxide from plants. It's actually a very interesting way that we can do that now. We can do it from space, in fact. And I won't go into the details unless somebody really wants to know how the spectroscopy works. But essentially, we can see from space when plants are photosynthesizing. And when they photosynthesize, they absorb carbon dioxide as part of the photosynthesis process. But it's complicated. It's more complicated than just planting a tree and saying, okay, I've done something. The type of tree matters. How young or old that tree is matters. The density of those trees matter. The amount of fertilizer you put onto that tree matters a lot. And so it's a tricky thing to do well, and to quantify properly. So in the city of Toronto, we've done pretty extensive work on trying to assess how much carbon sequestration is happening from the vegetation around the city itself. And we need to know that because a molecule of CO2 looks like a molecule of CO2, whether it comes from the tailpipe of your car or from a tree respiring to our measurement devices. And so we have we're developing a pretty good handle on that so that we know how much of the carbon dioxide we see in the atmosphere is from the vegetation and how much is from your tailpipe or other industrial processes. But with nature-based solutions, I mean, I'm sure most of you remember the 2023 wildfires that raged across the country. And there was a study that was published in the last year that showed that from the wildfires alone, the carbon emissions from those wildfires would represent the fourth largest country's worth of emissions, so only behind the US, China, and India. And so these nature-based solutions have potential, but they also have the potential to be exactly the opposite of what we want them to be in terms of returning all of that carbon to the atmosphere. So I hope I've answered your question there.
Yeah, this is great insight. Thank you so much. And yes, indeed, I saw this report when it came out, and it was really mind-blowing to see the impact these wildfires had. So we go next to a question to Peter again. How do we mobilize around the development of progressive carbon tax when the people with the most political leverage are also the one who have the highest income and are also higher emitters, and they won't want to do it? So can you maybe comment on that, Peter?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So, I mean, of course, in a political system that has been captured by an oligarchy, that becomes tricky, right? And even when, as you rightly say, the influence of the high emitters is disproportionate, it is difficult, right? But from one perspective, it should be possible. There's a large majority of people who would benefit from a progressive carbon tax, as opposed to a relatively small amount of people who would have to limit and change their behavior, right? So from that perspective, there should be a political opening here that parties could explore. Unfortunately, right now in the political landscape, there's very few parties who are willing to go in that direction. Another consideration that worries me in this context is that one of the reasons why we might not see political parties trying to go in that direction is the fact that resistance towards carbon taxes is actually less based on financial considerations and more based on identity considerations, right? So when you look at the financial considerations, as I tried to show, it's actually in most people's financial interest to have a progressive carbon tax. So for the longest time, I was wondering, well, why aren't there at least more people calling for it, even if we have political resistance from the wealthy? And I think one of the reasons is that there are identity considerations from that lead people to resist this kind of change. And I think those identity considerations have to be taken seriously. Someone who works in the Canadian oil and gas industry will resist this kind of development. So what can we do as a society to show people like this that another world is possible, and that it would also, in one important sense, be a better world for them, to bring them on board for this kind of change? I think that's the crux of the question, especially in a natural resource economy like Canada.
Yes, absolutely. And if I may add to this, I think that the current situation in which the carbon tax is really unpopular, while at the same time, as you demonstrated, is pretty financially neutral to most Canadians in the current state, and yet people are opposing it, really shows that the issue is probably not financial, as you mentioned, but rather an identity politics marker. So I think that it would be really interesting to work on these aspects indeed, because a progressive carbon tax is going to be hard to implement in the current base because of that reason, right? Thank you very much. So we'll take the next question. Peter, you mentioned tax on industry would be different in your ideal view. How would you propose a tax for industry? Also on a progressive basis, maybe? Also a question to Deborah. You mentioned that the combined sewer outfalls. This brings the question, how would carbon tax be applied to municipalities? Could it be done on a progressive basis as well? If so, how would larger cities with also larger greenhouse gas emissions deal with higher tax in smaller towns? So a bit of question for everybody. Who wants to start? Do you want to maybe get more of a handle on the tax, Peter, and then we'll segue to Deborah to talk more about municipalities?
I can start. I mean, so I've worked on this question of the progressive carbon tax for individuals, and at the end of that reflection, I am asking the same question that you ask here. What would that mean? What would transposing that idea mean in the industrial context? Could we imagine a carbon tax for industrial emitters that is also progressive in some sense? So I have to admit that I haven't thought this through in detail, but I think in principle, this could also be an interesting idea. Though one could also imagine just a tax on industrial emitters that tries to lower their production levels and then leave the progressive side to the consumer. For the moment, that is the idea that I'm defending here. We need a progressive carbon tax on the individual side, and we keep things as they are, or maybe make them a little more stringent. So we raise the price of carbon emissions on the industrial side, but we don't make it progressive in that context. But different combinations are possible here.
And do you have a say on municipalities, maybe, or will they be taxed through the consumer behavior?
I don't have a view on that, but maybe this is a good point for me to slide in my question to Deborah. So Deborah, you said that in Canada, 80% of emissions come from cities, and worldwide, 70% of emissions come from cities. So the question that I asked in my head is, well, how does that relate to emissions per head? I don't have the numbers at my fingertips how many people in Canada live in cities. So are the emissions per head in Canadian cities higher than the emissions per head in rural areas? What are those? How does that dimension play into these considerations?
So, and this actually points to Nemi's question later. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but generally the more in Canada, or at least in Ontario, the more densely populated parts of the province have a lower per capita emission than the places that are less densely populated. So density brings down emissions per person, which is interesting. And I think there's a lot of potential for sort of making use of that. You can make things more compact. You don't have to drive at all if you don't need to, when things are convenient and located close by. Yeah, so it's actually a little bit counterintuitive in that way.
But then maybe a follow-up to that is that cities in North America have a city center that's very dense, but then they have a lot of suburban areas around. And it's really well known that this is, it's a lot more, there's a lot more emission per capita in those regions because of the lower density. So when you account for instance, the impact in terms of emissions of sewage system, for instance, as it's been topic of your discussion, you need to account for that as well. It's going to emit a lot more because you have pipes that run longer distances and whatever. So do you find that it is the reason why, for instance, cities in Canada emit a lot? Like we have a model where we have really large suburban areas.
I'm not sure I know how to answer that question with the research that I've done, but I think everything you've said is true. But we did do a study recently looking at what the carbon sequestration potential would be for if they if the provincial government actually went ahead and built on the green belt as they were planning to. And it turns out that when you clear cut these forests or croplands in order to put up housing, you lose out quite a bit in carbon sequestration over the period of the construction. And so that's another consideration to make as well, is not only that it's urban sprawl and things get further away and more difficult to get to and your travel times get longer, but you're also getting rid of what could have been natural wetlands and forests that could have been helping us instead of hindering.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelly Finnegan, for your question. So we go to the question in namely, which I think you started to allude to, Deborah. So it's the building environment that produces nearly 50% of emissions. Building material like concrete, steel, aluminum amount to nearly 25% of global emissions. We have someone who knows about this business here. Are we simply ignoring the elephant in the room and dancing around the issue? It's technological innovation in physical science and engineering that will fix this problem, and we are sadly focusing on AI and quantum computing that does nothing. So anyone wants to comment on that? So the part of emission that is really linked to infrastructure.
So I guess I can start. So it's certainly true, and colleagues of mine spend a lot of time calculating the carbon emissions from building houses, and there are lots of really interesting papers that quantify that. I would say, though, that still the fact is that the more densely populated places are per capita lower in emissions, and so there's two edges to this. I'm not going to comment on the AI or quantum computing. This is outside of my area of expertise, but I think there are building materials and there are ways of building structures that are far less carbon intensive than others. And we can make use of those and have a denser, more compact and efficient city if we tried.
Yeah, and I can add, with my hat as a chemist, that there's a lot of innovation that is being developed in order to make concrete, steel, and aluminum in particular less emissive. Some of these technologies being developed in Canada through, using concrete for CO2 sequestration or using alternative sources of energy for aluminum or steel industry. So, but it's true. We need research, and we need to continue to sustain research for these types of materials. Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Nemi, for your question. Do you want? Oh, sorry, Peter, go ahead.
I can't resist to jump in on this issue too. So I agree with you, Nemi, that that technological innovation will be important in addressing the problem, but I would also emphasize the importance at the same time of social innovations. Right? So this kind of idea of a progressive carbon tax is also a form of innovation. It's a social innovation, right? And I think we need to push forward on as many tracks in parallel as we can, and also be aware of the fact that in all these categories there might be drawbacks too. So, for instance, when I hear people, I'm not putting this into your mouth here, but when I hear people who have faith in technological innovation and who say, well, the solution to climate change is geoengineering, I get a little nervous about the unintended side effects of geoengineering, right? We don't really know what we're getting ourselves into at this point. I'm not saying we shouldn't consider it. We should seriously consider it. But there are certain social innovations that we know would work, and we're leaving them on the table. And I think that's irresponsible.
And another answer could be too that the tax you raise on this could be used towards, parts of it could be used towards research and fueling some of this solution finding approach. Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Nemi, and thanks a lot, Deborah and Peter, for your answers. We get to the question of Devin. A follow-up on the mention of the wildfire. Natural emissions are not counted within our NDCs. Can there be technically? Should there be? This is a bit of a philosophical question. So I guess it's a question for both of you, actually. So maybe you can start, Deborah, because it's maybe a bit closer to home, but I'm sure Peter will want to comment on it.
So I think I would need some clarification on this, but natural emissions, are you talking about wetlands and those sorts of things? I think that's likely what you're talking about.
My understanding is that Devin is referring to the fact that it's not counted as the country's emission as per the IPCC counts. Is that correct?
That sounds, unmanaged lands, I think was an update. Right. I think this is a philosophical question, honestly. I think I'm going to punt to Peter on this one. Could they, I mean, we can presumably quantify the emissions, and we do quantify wetland and unmanaged forest, fire, and all of those emissions. Whether we want to count that, I'm not sure. I'm not even sure we want to count. I even struggle with the concept of net zero to begin with, particularly when it comes to counting our forests, because I think that's fraught. So I'm gonna stop there.
Thanks a lot, Deborah. Do you want to step in, Peter?
Yeah, so I think we need to disentangle two issues here. One is the question of measurement, right? So Deborah and colleagues are working on this, right? But pending a precise way of really saying, okay, this is how many emissions stem from this and this source precisely. What we see in practice right now is people basically trying to pass the baton to others, right? This whole debate about level 1, level 2, level 3 emissions. What the game that Canada and other countries are playing is trying to say, oh no, these are not my emissions. Those are the emissions of those people over there, right? And so as long as we don't have the science to stop that strategic game from being played and to say, well, no, you're the one who's responsible for those emissions, that's going to be a problem in any debate about moving forward. So that's one of the issues. That's the practical issue of measurement. So then there is take the concrete case of wildfires in Canada. Right? I think this is a really interesting question. Should they be counted as Canadian emissions? So my thought here, if we had the precise measurements, right, would be the following. I think they should be counted as Canadian emissions to the proportion that Canadian emissions cause climate change worldwide. Because climate change is a global phenomenon, right? It's not just emissions in Canada that are responsible for the increased risk of wildfires, right? So these new threats, the responsibility for them should be apportioned to the emitters worldwide. Again, from a theoretical perspective, can we practically do this? Very difficult, right? Do we have precise enough measurements to do it? No. But that's how I would answer the philosophical question. Then there's the whole debate about how to actually do it in practice, where I put my faith in Deborah and her colleagues.
Thanks a lot, Devin, for your question. So the next one is from Gendrona, and c'est une question en français, et c'est très proche d'une question que j'avais pour toi aussi, Peter, donc ça tombe bien. Est-ce qu'il existe des outils qui permettent de modéliser le comportement des consommateurs canadiens dans le but de comparer et même de quantifier l'efficacité des différents types de taxes carbone et pour comparer, par exemple, la taxe carbone progressive que tu proposes par opposition à la taxe carbone actuelle que l'on a. Et donc, ma question à moi, qui est très proche de ça, c'est est-ce qu'on a mesuré aujourd'hui quelle était l'efficacité? Parce que tu dis, on n'a pas baissé assez. Mais est-ce qu'on est capable d'aller chercher, d'aller comprendre en fait comment les gens ont réagi en fonction de leur niveau de revenu pour comprendre à quel point la taxe actuelle a été efficace en fonction des revenus des gens?
Encore une fois, une bonne question. Plusieurs aspects ici. Alors, première question, est-ce que on a des modèles ou des analyses qui nous disent jusqu'à quel point la taxe actuelle a été efficace pour changer le comportement des consommateurs?
Mm.
Je pense que là, il y a des analyses. Malheureusement, j'ai pas des exemples concrets à vous donner à ce stade-ci. Euh, L'autre question qui est intéressante ici, c'est de produire des modèles qui euh, analysent jusqu'à quel point une taxe progressive sur le carbone pourrait être plus efficace. Hein.
Mhm.
Et là, alors là, je devrais peut-être souligner que cette idée comme je l'ai dit dans la présentation, l'idée d'une taxe progressive sur le carbone, elle n'est pas nouvelle. Hein. Il y a par exemple l'économiste Thomas Piketty et son co-auteur Lucas Chancel qui, déjà avant l'accord de Paris 2015, ont dit à la communauté internationale, écoutez, ces engagements en termes d'émissions nationales ne sont pas la bonne façon à procéder. Il faut regarder les individus. Hein. Euh, et c'est eux qui ont souligné l'importance du fait qu'il y a les 10% des émetteurs individuels les plus importants qui sont responsables pour 50% des émissions. Maintenant, on pourrait construire un modèle économique qui pose la question, quelle serait, sous certaines prémices, comme toujours dans des modèles économiques, quelle serait la réaction des agents économiques à une taxe progressive sur le carbone? Alors, je pense que ça serait un exercice utile pour souligner la promesse de cette politique. Malheureusement, je suis pas au courant qu'il y ait déjà une étude de ce type-là, mais ce serait intéressant de poursuivre cette idée.
Ouais, c'est une excellente idée en effet. Merci beaucoup, Gendrona, pour ta question. Uh, okay, we have another one from Nemi again. A very productive discussion. Final question, I promise. Carbon capture, sequestration, and use is an ineffective idea and sadly gives the polluters a license to pollute more. Needs more carbon than it can address. Can you comment on that? So I don't know, Deborah, do you have any
This is not my area of expertise, but that summarizes my understanding of it. That's my only comment.
Yeah.
I'm afraid that's all I can say too.
Yeah, I think from my knowledge as well, it's pretty nascent. There might be some solutions in the future, but right now it's not working great and certainly cannot be looked as a current solution by anyone. So Kelly Finnegan asks another question. Thanks a lot, Nemi, for your question. Deborah mentions 80% of the greenhouse gas are a result of cities or in cities. I understand most of these are from burning fossil fuels. Combining these and GHGs with the oil production sourcing GHGs account for the vast majority of Canada's GHGs. If we do not use effective carbon taxes, which policy tools remain? Consumption targets, individual quotas for people and companies, production targets, hard and declining caps for fossil fuel industry, or outright ban of fossil fuels, somewhat similar to bans of asbestos, BPA, and other harmful items. So this is really great. It's looking more into the theory of how the carbon tax was first proposed, Peter. So maybe you can address that to begin with.
Yeah, I think this is an important step in broadening our discussion from just using the carrot, a financial incentive, a carbon tax, to either the carrot or the stick or persuasion, right? Those are the three big categories in how we get people to do what needs to be done. We can persuade them, or we can tell them you can't do this, or we set a financial incentive. And I think ultimately, I think we need to work on all three fronts. I think there there are some cases that I gave about progressive carbon taxation where ultimately I would actually consider a ban to be more effective, right? So rather than have a carbon tax that is so high that it convinces someone not to operate a private jet, I think this is a category of goods that we should just ban to start with. People can take commercial planes. And those are the kinds of steps, again, that I think would be a step in the right direction. The average Canadian can't take a private jet anyway. But I think symbolically in the fight against climate change, I think it would send an important signal that everyone has to adjust their behavior, not just the lower and middle income Canadians, right? That's the message that is being sent right now. And I think that's a large part of the explanation why there is so much resistance. People see the carbon tax as a tax by the elites for the elites. And they're right. The current carbon tax that we have is a tax of that nature. So I think combining it with bans of certain activities, outright bans, is probably the right way to go.
Deborah, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I actually wanted to follow up with Peter. I have something I've been thinking about for a while and don't know how you might implement, is that I feel as though the easiest way to convince people to do something is to make it the most convenient and cheapest and most economical and most pleasant way of doing things. For example, if transit in Toronto were convenient and were the fastest way to get around and were the most, if you wanted to get from one end of the city to the other and you knew you could get there in 15 or 20 minutes or something. So how do we implement policies that put the infrastructure in place to allow people to make decisions that are good for the planet, but also good for themselves simultaneously?
So the first thing I would say here is that it's already the cheapest way from a collective perspective, but that's not reflected in the current prices, right? So this is what economic theory tells us. It tells us that there are all these negative externalities, the social and environmental costs of private activities such as using your car, taking a flight, carbon intensive activities, but those negative externalities are not reflected in the prices. Right? So it is already the case that public transport is cheaper. Unfortunately, that's not reflected in the current prices of public transport and private transport. Right? So we can work on two fronts here. We can, on the one hand, work to internalize those negative externalities, as people have been advocating. You'll hardly find any economist who is not in favor of a carbon tax, because that is the way to incorporate those costs. Right? And on the other side of the equation, we can, as you say, we can make the less polluting activities more attractive. Now, unfortunately, politicians these days are not very willing to go out of their way to do that. Justin Trudeau only once he's a sitting duck at the end of lame duck at the end of his tenure will announce a high-speed rail link between Toronto and Quebec. He didn't do this on the first day in office. He did it on the last day in office. And as soon as he's out of power, who knows what's going to happen to the project anyway. So, yeah, again, I think we need to work on both of these fronts. But I always find it very important to resist the suggestion, and I'm not saying you said that necessarily, but even when we observe that it's cheaper to use your car, that's the wrong way to put it. It's not cheaper from a social perspective to use your car, just from a private.
But it's not even cheaper today. I mean, it is already more expensive to use your car, but for all sorts of reasons, people will still choose to use the car. So there's also something that has to do with psychology, and it is already reflected to some extent. I agree with you that it's not reflected to the point that all the externality are embedded inside the price of both the car and the public transport, but it is already more expensive today to use your car in a lot of cases. And it's still, people will not make that choice. So
it's not necessarily more convenient. I think that was Deborah's important point.
Yeah, the convenience, I agree. The convenience, I agree. Although, I mean, if you look at the traffic jams in Montreal, certainly, and I'm hearing Toronto is the same. Sometimes I don't know. I mean, if the metro is down for 20 minutes, people get completely mad. But if they're 20 minutes late because they're in a traffic jam, it doesn't have the same impact. So there's a lot of, I think, perception as well in these things that are difficult to work on. And I think there's reinforcement as well that gets on as well. So I can't resist though, just plug in something here because it's been, so the Eco-Fiscal Commission that actually one of my colleagues at McGill has been working on a lot, actually made the calculation when the carbon tax was started 10 years ago. And one of the benefit of the carbon taxes compared to these other means is actually it is more economically effective. So everybody benefits. The GDP cost is the lowest for the tax compared to all of these other things. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't use some of these as well. But if you want to minimize the cost for everybody, the carbon tax actually ends up being a really effective mechanism. And I agree that it could be combined with some symbolic things around bans of certain items that are particularly bad, as you mentioned, the jets. But there's a lot of data from economists that have compared these types of solutions and discovered the tax to actually being incredibly effective when it's used well and accepted socially, obviously. So we'll finish with this last little question from Heather Stickley, who was asking you, Deborah, you mentioned the notion of net zero and saying you're not really, you have some hesitations around it. So I think she wanted to have your opinion on that.
Oh, now I've gotten myself in trouble. Okay. My hesitation about net zero is that fundamentally, we need to reduce the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, period, full stop. And relying on either carbon sequestration from natural-based solutions or some technology that doesn't exist today and might exist in the future to remove greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, I think provides a way out from really doing the hard work of reducing the atmospheric burden of greenhouse gases. And so I worry that phrase net zero gives people the sense that there is a real easy way to remove emissions from the atmosphere, and there really isn't. That's where my hesitation comes from.
I don't think you've got yourself into trouble, Deborah. I think it makes a lot of sense. I agree with you as well. I think it is sometimes used as a way for people to get out of it in an easy way. Any points that you would like to add to conclude, Deborah or Peter?
No, just thanks for the questions.
Exactly. Great question, great discussion. Thank you. Yeah,
thank you so much for you, Peter and Deborah, for your answers, and thank you so much for the audience. It was very lively, and there were lots of questions and comments. Thank you so much for being there today. So again, thank you very much for being here today. This was really fantastic discussion. I would like to, again, thank you for attending this RSC College webinar. I would like to announce as well that our next webinar will be late May. The date will be announced shortly, and the topic will be secularism. So this is really interesting, and we'll be in Montreal to discuss it, which will be even more fun. So we'll run a hybrid webinar this time. It will be in person and online. So I really encourage you to look out for it and register for it. Thank you again so much for discussing the carbon cycle and carbon tax in this current hot political context. Thank you so much again, Professor Peter Deitch from University of Victoria, Professor Deborah Wunsch from University of Toronto. Thank you so much for being with us today. Have a great day.
Thank you for moderating.